Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Second day at MHA. Is everybody having a good time? Post lunch? Not yet the food coma that hits around 2, so I'm hoping we ride this nice afternoon wave. Yes? Okay. So, welcome to the Selfie generation exploring self-diagnosis and social media among Gen Z. My name is Teresa, and I'm moderating the session for you today. If you have any assistance, just a note to the people online. Hi, everybody out there. If you have any questions, use the QA tab. For the people in the room, you can use the app and ask QA tab. I'll also try to run around and bring you a microphone. And if there's some discussion, do the same, just so everybody online virtually can also hear what's happening in the room and be part of this awesome community. So you're at MHA. I don't think I need to repeat that again, right? We all know where we are. If you're interested in continuing education credits, there's an Earn CEU tab at the conference app, and just helping to complete that session evaluation is some data that goes back to our speakers and helps us understand what kind of sessions really resonate with our audience. And then if any of you are on social, that's what this is about. So you can post something and tag MHA, and we can all be fast friends. If anybody needs a moment, welcome to stand up, take a moment, walk over to our wellness room and settle yourself down. And then I'm going to present our speakers who will, I'm sure, share more about who they are. So we have Esther Fernandez, who is the social lead and content strategist with the Made of Millions Foundation. Dr. Courtney Tracy, who is licensed psychotherapist and author, host, creator, founder of Exist Centers, all those things. She's a force. Yeah, all of it is what I've heard, yeah. But also I'm gonna say High Tide, Mental Health, and Truth Doctor Media, because I wanna give you kudos to all the things that you're working on. Awesome. And then Uma Chatterjee, thank you. Neuroscientist and PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, president of OCD Wisconsin, and on the Lived Experience Council at One Mind. Wow, I am so impressed. I am going to turn it over to them. Everybody, welcome on. Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. This is the Selfie generation, self-diagnosis, social media, pretty self-explanatory. We think the name is pretty clever. But my name is Esther Fernandez, she, her. I work for the Made of Millions Foundation, and we're a global advocacy nonprofit on a mission to change how the world perceives mental health. And usually when I talk about our organization, I like to go way to the very beginning. So when my boss, our executive director, Aaron Harvey, was really young, around the age of 12, he started getting really debilitating, intrusive thoughts about really taboo themes, so things like sex, religion, harming people, and he had no idea what these thoughts meant. He was like, they were really persistent, they did not align with his character, and he kind of silently struggled with these intrusive thoughts for decades, eventually getting to the point of substance use and suicidality. And at the same time, he was working in marketing in New York, and he was working in an ad agency, and he was really successful on the outside but struggling on the inside until he had kind of reached his breaking point. He went to Google, he searched violent thoughts, and he found out he had OCD. And he was like, whoa, had no idea this was a thing. And from his kind of marketing background, he came up with this really searchable, easily accessible website called intrusivethoughts.org. But from doing OCD advocacy, he's like, wow, people get a lot of things wrong about mental health in general. So we later rebranded as Made of Millions, and our name kind of stands for the millions of people who struggle with mental health every day. And my story is kind of similar. I found Made of Millions back in 2020-ish. When I found out I had OCD, they were one of the first organizations that popped up. And now I'm just really lucky that I'm able to give back to a lot of people in the same way that I think MADE has given to me. And I help to educate people on a lot of topics. I'm particularly interested in OCD. I live with OCD. I also live with complex trauma and derealization. And yeah, I'm just super excited to be here. So Dr. Courtney, if you want to go next with introducing yourself. Oh, I just realized I have a clicker. Our faces. Love it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dr. Courtney Tracy. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a soon-to-be licensed psychologist in the state of California, Washington, and Oregon. And I found treatment centers for a living. I first went to treatment when I was 15 years old, and I was addicted to methamphetamine and psychedelics. I got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at 22 years old, and from 22 to 35, I gained 4 degrees, 4 mental health businesses, have a successful marriage with my husband, high school sweetheart of 20 years, and 2 beautiful children. And I think it's important to say that because the stigma of BPD is often that none of that is possible. I'm also the first therapist in America to reach 1 million followers on TikTok through sharing information that combines lived experience and clinical expertise. And I look forward to sharing that more with you. Thank you.
Awesome. That was such a great profile.
We're stoked in this audience. Uma, if you'd like to go next.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited and honored to be here with you all. My name is Uma Chatterjee. I was born with severe, debilitating obsessive-compulsive disorder. I developed PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, generalized anxiety, and eating disorder, just so many diagnoses and labels, but the most important part of my story is that I had absolutely no access to treatment or awareness of what was going on in my life for so many reasons that we might get into today. I was debilitated by these conditions. I attempted on my life many times, starting at the age of 13. I was institutionalized, and I was a college dropout. I couldn't leave my house, and I had no reason to live. And because of finally getting evidence-based treatment and proper diagnoses 25 years into almost losing my life to these conditions, I completely had my life turned around. I was able to go back to school and found a deep passion in trying to understand what on earth was going on in my brain and those of the people I love, and what can we do to improve access to treatment and awareness, and at the same time, using my own lived experience to raise awareness for so many of these conditions, especially OCD, that's so misunderstood. And so today I work and live as a researcher studying my own conditions. I bridge lived experience, advocacy, and research through science communication. I host a podcast called Chat with Uma. I'm in a number of leadership positions. And most importantly, just like Dr. Courtney said, it's so important to know that healing and hope and recovery is possible even when you are living with these conditions, and both things can be true. So I'm just so grateful to be here to share this message today.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. I have like a wonky knee, but if I knew how to do like a cartwheel, I'd do it on stage right now. Yeah, super stoked, smart people right next to me, but let's get into it. So what is the state of mental health right now? So at one point, we feel like mental health was a pretty taboo topic, but as everyone here in the room knows, sort of in the past decade, it has exploded in popularity in so many different aspects in society. It's prominent in pop culture. There's a rise in therapy apps. It's seen as an extra little perk in the workplace, especially post-pandemic. But despite all of this traction that mental health has made, we do feel like as people who, you know, are very online, that there is sort of like people are missing the mark on some really important aspects to mental health, especially when it comes to social media. And again, for context, this entire panel and also the organization that I work for is made up of people with lived experience. We have received a lot of life-changing information and education through the internet, and we're also content creators. We're people with audiences who listen to us and look up to us, and so we just wanted to create this research report that really accurately captures what we experience day to day. And so really quick, just to look at the numbers, our report surveyed 1,250 Gen Zs and parents in the US and Canada who were either part of the general population at some point on the mental health journey or parents of Gen Zs struggling with a mental health condition. All of our statistics were nationally representative, and if you're into all the details, I'll link our research paper at the end. And we also kind of mapped out 5 key points on this mental health journey. So we have onset, this is when your symptoms first start showing up. We have research, when you're looking into these symptoms, so think Googling, reading a book, talking to a doctor. We have diagnosis, which could be self-diagnosis, professional diagnosis, or misdiagnosis. Treatment, which can include therapy, medication, hospitalization, support groups, alternative methods. And management or maintenance, which is when you do all of the above with success and you're living well within your condition. We're kind of going to be referencing some of this language as we're going throughout this report. And now to get a full picture of what Gen Z really looks like, we're going to be playing a little clip from, we did like a video version of our research report, and let me see if I'm technologically gifted enough for this. Oh my God,
In the
Slay.
last decade, pop culture and social media have exploded with mental health references, characters, and information. Seriously, it's everywhere. Known as digital natives, Gen Z is the generation that is constantly tuned in, which, unsurprisingly, can get pretty overwhelming. When they scroll their feeds, they might see a live stream of police brutality, warnings about climate change, and heated political debates,
You could do abortions.
all within 30 seconds of waking up.
Now, every terrible thing is in their pockets. And they have so much more information, and we're not wired to be exposed to that much information and that much negativity.
The result is increased feelings of nihilism, existential angst, and a hesitancy to pursue traditional healthcare. Because why rely on larger systems when they can't even stop the world from burning? And ironically, being desensitized to mental health issues can swing into the opposite direction and spiral into over-pathologizing behaviors. Gen Z is also struggling with finding a path forward when they do attempt to pursue traditional healthcare paths. Some of the biggest barriers our respondents mention when trying to start their treatment journey include long wait lists for therapy, financial strain, and issues with insurance. So what do young people do when so many paths are blocked off? Try their best to self-therapize.
It's a little trippy seeing myself speak on there. I'm like, that's me.
In the last
Not again. We don't need all that. So yeah, I think if there were 2 words to describe my generation, I am Gen Z, it would be that we're online and that we're really overwhelmed. And I think, like the video was mentioning, part of growing up as like the first generation of digital natives, a really unique aspect to that is that we're kind of getting unfiltered information and news about everyone and everything all the time. It's not really reviewed. It's just people live streaming and live tweeting, and it's a lot of information. And especially these days, there's a lot to be overwhelmed about: the economy and climate change and international crises. And even if you are, not Gen Z, these things can be really overwhelming. And so just imagine kind of being younger and trying to navigate that. Especially post-pandemic, I feel like it only exacerbated people's feelings when they're isolated and super online. And our report reflected this. We found that 1 in 3 Gen Zs say that fear of the future is a top influencer on their mental health. And to me, it is not surprising that a generation that is being fed a lot of information is over-intellectualizing and maybe over-pathologizing all of that. And they're really just desperate for answers and validation and community. And this kind of brings us to our first question for Dr. Courtney. As we're kind of seeing a lot of young people trying to cope with the world, and they're starting to think that, maybe I am just supposed to be depressed and anxious all the time because of everything that I'm consuming. Can you kind of describe like the Gen Z clients that you see, and how do you think their relationship to things like anxiety or depression is as they're coming into like your office?
Definitely. So as I mentioned, I found treatment centers for a living. And so when clients are coming to me, one-on-one therapy, 1 to even 3 times a week isn't enough. So I'm seeing the Gen Z clients that need at least 3 to 6 hours of care, at least 3 to 5 days a week. And so it's really the apex of Gen Z crisis when it comes to mental health. What I see is that they are digitally informed and highly self-aware. And I say digitally informed because it doesn't necessarily mean that all the information that they've been taking in is 100% accurate. But I say self-aware because I think back in the day, and of course I was born in 1990, so I don't know what it was like before I was born, but I have I believe that most people didn't need to look inward as often as children have to look inward to ask themselves, who am I and why do I feel this way? It was okay to just go play on the street with your friends and think about the career that you wanted in the future and to live in the family values that hopefully were within the household you lived in. And these days, like what we saw when we saw that scrolling through social media just now of all of the chaos that is so easily absorbed into Gen Z's brains, they're constantly asking themselves that question, who am I? What is the world like? Who am I supposed to show up as, and how can I show up as anybody when I feel so bad? It makes me start shaking even to think about the clients that I treat and how much they struggle. And you said something about pathologizing, and I think that that's really important. A lot of the conversation when it comes to social media and the younger generations right now is that they are over-pathologizing because there's so much mental health information out there. But the way that the human brain works is we look for what's familiar on the outside, And if they're looking for mental health content, whether it's correct or incorrect, it means that they are acknowledging that there's a mental health issue going on for them internally. So they come in and they're informed. Now, some clinicians will be really upset about that. Oh my God, I had a client come in and they thought they had OCD and they thought they had BPD and everybody thinks they have ADHD and autism. And the thing is, and we'll get to a story about self-diagnosis with autism soon, but I say you're welcome for giving them information and having them show up in your office to ask more questions. I think it's important that the teenagers are saying, I think I might have anxiety. Because even if they don't have diagnosable anxiety, they're experiencing some type of stress to make them feel that way. And so they come in and they have all this information that just isn't quite categorized as it should be because they stayed up for 3 hours watching 50 videos on the diagnosis that they think that they have. But it's also overwhelming. I mean, think about like going to the grocery store for the very first time and there's just unlimited options for you to choose from. You're just trying to make a couple meals. These people have so much information and they just want to know what's wrong with them. They just want to know why they can't keep a job and why they dropped out of college and why they can't find a partner and why they don't see a future and why they want to die. We call Gen Z the generation of anxiety and depression, and that is deeply disturbing. But there's a reason for it. And I think that the way that they show up in my office having information is actually a good place to start. Social media has become the triage for mental health. And this conversation that we're having right now is to acknowledge the benefits and the consequences of it and to deal with them as clinicians when these people come into our office.
Yeah, I really liked the triage line. I heard a couple but I think that kind of segues us into our next part, which is let's get to the heart of this conversation, self-diagnosis. So a lot of the times when people hear you talk about these types of topics or when they just even hear the word self-diagnosis, they will have a lot of hesitations. There's usually this assumption that a lot of young people are just being very attention-seeking or they're being really careless when they just kind of choose this label, but actually the research that we found shows that the majority of Gen Z is not just taking a label and stopping there. Actually, in more than 90% of cases, Gen Zs are coupling their self-diagnosis with a professional one, or they're planning to. So this means only 5% are only self-diagnosed. And our organization has always said that our content is a launching pad. We never, ever, ever want the end goal to only be social media content for mental health education, but it is a really great tool and vehicle for introducing a lot of new topics to people that might have never known something prior to that. And over the years, as we've been content creators and also as I've been working with this organization, the story that we constantly hear is that, you know, someone gets content on their feed or they're finding something on our website, they're searching through, we introduce them to these new concepts, we point them to longer forms of content, so things like podcasts or books or articles that they can read, and then from doing their long-form research, they're then able to turn to in-person clinical care. And so I think to really illustrate this journey, I think both people on our panel have had similar experiences. So Uma, if you could start us off talking about your self-diagnosis journey, especially when it comes to OCD specifically, and just all the clinicians you saw and misdiagnoses.
Yeah, so as I had mentioned in briefly introducing myself, I was born with severe, debilitating, clinically extreme OCD. It showed up from the earliest memories that I had. It colored my entire trajectory through my childhood and upbringing in life. And importantly for me, I was born into an immigrant household that had zero financial access to any sort of support. There was also such a huge amount of stigma around naming anything going on internally or mentally. And this added expectation of, you shouldn't have any problems. We work so hard to come here to give you this life that anything you're experiencing doesn't really matter. And so I grew up with those circumstances into, you know, attempting on my life, being institutionalized, getting misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed through 22 different clinicians from the ages of 12 to 25 years old. I was diagnosed after being admitted for a suicide attempt with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and panic disorder, but OCD and PTSD were never found at all. And there's a whole story back there, but to keep this short, the devastating consequences of that, not only did I lose all functionality, I dropped out of college with a 1.83 GPA, I couldn't leave my house, I continually attempted on my life, I was diagnosed with cancer and wished it would kill me because that's how much I was suffering, all because I didn't get the proper diagnosis or treatment in time, and no one could control the onset of these conditions for me. I'm trying to study that, but I certainly could have been helped if I got the proper treatment. So all that to say, I was failed by every type of medical and mental health provider imaginable. Finally, in thinking about ending my life again at the age of 25, I'm Googling these thoughts I had never had the gall to Google, because at that point I was at the end of my rope, and through social media content creators, therapists with lived experience, talking about what OCD actually was, what these taboo harm themes meant, and most importantly, what the actual evidence-based treatment was after going through a Rolodex of like 20 different types of therapies, countless medications, nothing working for me. I'm here being told that I'm in this treatment that I was told I should be in treatment by my culture. I find myself in this treatment, I'm not getting better, so I'm internalizing it as I'm a monster, and there's not actually something wrong with me from a mental health perspective, I just need to die. And that was the consequence of being misdiagnosed and mistreated for so long, and to have to face that and finally then start this new treatment called exposure and response prevention, the frontline gold standard treatment for OCD that I hadn't heard from 22 different clinicians over a decade, was wild to me, but that's why I'm alive and here, and that's why social media saved my life.
Yeah, thank you, Uma. I mean, there's so many points in there that you just hear over and over again in OCD world specifically. Even just the cancer line is, I feel like, sadly, something a lot of people with OCD think is like, oh, I just wish something else would take me out. And then you go on the internet and you find out, oh, ERP is the gold standard treatment. And once you finally make it into the online space, you realize, oh, these people are so well informed, and there's just so many great advocates online. And so, yeah, just thank you for sharing your story. Dr. Courtney, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your story with self-diagnosis and autism, because I think that's really interesting, especially as a clinician.
Yeah, thank you. I grew up in a multi-generational household with my grandparents, my mom, my half-brother, and my uncle. My uncle has really severe level 3 autism and additional developmental delays. And I believe that my grandfather did as well. He's no longer here. I mentioned I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at 22. I was also diagnosed formally with level 1 autism when I was 33 years old. The only reason that I searched out for the diagnosis that was underlying the severe emotional dysregulation disorder that I had was because I was on TikTok. I am a clinician of 12 years. I have 4 degrees, and I did not know that I had autism. It runs in my family, and I suffer from it every single day. And that conversation is one that many other people that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are having today, that there's an underlying sensory experience that is causing the emotional struggle that we go through. And I learned a lot about a lot, and I couldn't see it in myself. I had to see videos of people with lived experience. I had to see people explaining aspects of my life that other people experienced in a way that made me feel like maybe there's something else going on here. And I'm a really good diagnostician, so eventually I found my way to a psychologist and gave her all of the details of all of the symptoms that could not be categorized in diagnoses that I already had, that I believed were results from the diagnoses that I had, but they weren't, they were the cause. And so maybe it makes me seem like not that informed as a clinician, but I promise you, if you are a clinician, you eventually find your expertise, and there's things you just don't know that much about. And so it is only because of brave individuals showing up on social media and just saying, this is me, and this is what I experience, and this is my diagnosis. I then knew to go to a professional, and now I encourage other people too. Now I'm on the other side. I share about borderline personality disorder and help people get that diagnosis from real professionals. And I'm not afraid to say that social media has saved my life, more so than my doctorate degree. I no longer want to die because I know what's wrong with me, and 12 years of clinical education couldn't give me that.
Thank you so much. I mean, just so powerful, and again, I feel like everyone on this panel has just, yeah, I understand what it's like to be so confused for basically your entire life, and then you just see one post on social media and suddenly everything changes. So as you guys can see, self-diagnosers are a lot more well-researched than people think. As we started looking more into this in our research, we saw that self-diagnosers report being more open to every form of treatment that we surveyed them about, including psychedelics and holistic medicine, but they are also less likely to be covered by health insurance, more likely to spend money on treatment, and more likely to be in healthcare debt. And why is that the case? Well, maybe people who are so invested in their mental health know that they need the specialized care, but they simply just don't have access to it. And this could also explain why they are trying maybe more alternative methods. And by this point, as we're starting to kind of piece together what this journey really looks like, now we're seeing that Gen Z isn't just, choosing a label really carelessly, but they're just trying their best with the resources that they do have available to them to find that answer, or to find answers and to find treatment. So this kind of brings us to our next set of questions, really at the heart of what we're here for. How do you even define a self-diagnosis? And is self-diagnosis valid? There are so many angles we can look at this from. Feel free to go back and forth, both of y'all. But yeah, how would you even define diagnosis and the role it plays in your life?
Sure. So a diagnosis, what is a diagnosis from a clinical perspective? A diagnosis is a category of symptoms named criteria, and if you meet a certain amount of those, then you're able to get the label of the disorder that you experience. The caveat there is that it has to not be due to medication, due to another medical issue, or due to another condition, and it needs to be causing significant ailments in multiple areas of life functioning. So in general, that's what a diagnosis is, but then the reason that we have the diagnosis process in general is because then we then take that and apply it to science. And Uma, you can take it from there.
So the purpose of a diagnosis, right, is to be able to label someone's suffering and the symptoms that they're experiencing and ultimately point them to the correct evidence-based treatments for that cluster of symptoms. And that's the best system we have right now, because as it currently stands with mental illness and really anything in the brain, we don't currently have biomarkers or the ability to identify it like with a blood test or with a brain scan. And that's not because they're not biological. They are. I'm a neuroscientist. It's because the brain is the most complex organ in the body, and we need to develop technology rapidly, and we need the money to do that. So at this point, because we are self-reporting our symptoms, and that's the best way to categorize it, we use diagnoses to point people and cluster these symptoms. The reality is, though, the brain is so complex, and as we already have talked about, there are so many symptoms that look like so many disorders, and we're sort of piecing them together, and more people often than not have comorbidities. They have more than one condition, and it's not from a scientific perspective because someone's born with the OCD brain or the borderline personality disorder brain or the autistic brain. It's because we have complex brains that give rise to so many different symptoms that all work together and cause unique dysfunction. And so diagnosis is valid and important in the world we live in now, and that's not necessarily the reality of how the brain operates. That's a very short way of saying it.
One thing I want to add too is, as a clinician, well, I was wrong about my own diagnosis to a degree, but doctors are wrong all the time. What is wrong with people finding information online and trying to help themselves? I really want us to pause and think about, maybe we're all okay with it in this room to a degree, but it's important to pause and think about it. It's okay if they're wrong, at least they're looking. And that's important. So is self-diagnosis valid? It's valid enough to get them into my treatment centers. They come in and say, what's wrong? We can't bill insurance from a self-diagnosis. They come in and they're so right a lot of the time. There is something wrong. Maybe it's not the right anxiety disorder, but it's anxiety and it's disordered, and we can help them figure out what it really is.
And case in point with statistics, just take OCD for an example. The current literature suggests that over 85% of clinicians, including medical doctors, don't diagnose it properly. That's a failure of information. That's a failure of awareness and training. That's not reflective of self-diagnosis not being valid. We're just being given information about these symptoms to identify the thing that most people aren't even seeing.
Yeah. I feel like our organization has talked a lot about even the role that self-diagnosis plays in someone's life. And a lot of the times, if you really think about what a diagnosis even is, you don't just walk into a doctor's office for no reason. It's because you have some sort of inclination that like something is happening. A lot of the times, an official diagnosis starts with a self-diagnosis. And so I just, really want to affirm that just because someone has a self-diagnosis, we shouldn't automatically just think that it is misinformed and they don't know what they're talking about. A lot of the times, as we're exploring in this research, that they're actually taking a lot of time to research this. So yeah, I think you kind of covered this a little before, Dr. Courtney, but I would like to know a little bit more about, there is so much resistance from clinicians specifically when it comes to Gen Z coming into their office and even going online themselves and being content creators themselves. And, not everyone wants to be talking face on TikTok. Like, I don't want to show my face. Like, that's too much work. But even just being involved in online spaces and writing articles or, I know you have a podcast and Uma, you had a podcast as well. And so you guys are online in like really variety of ways. And so how do you think clinicians can kind of find their niche and be open to being online? Again, they don't have to be content creators, but just being open to the world of just online mental health advocacy.
I think that that's a good question. Interestingly, social media has become the waiting room for therapy and for treatment. And most of the time, therapists are in the beginning, when they do have a platform, they're making their content saying, I never thought I would get a master's or a doctorate degree and then have to dance to hip hop videos to get my clients, to market my businesses. But once they do eventually go online, they realize that there's a community of people that are actively working to make sure that the information is accurate. Last week, I was flown to Harvard University to teach masters and public health students how to use social media correctly. I sit on FIDE's, the World Health Organization's board for misinformation, to help the world understand how to create accurate clinical information. I think it's important to see social media not as social media, but as information media. Like, this is where we get our information now. We're not really online that much to socialize. We're not sharing our meals with people anymore as often as we're sharing how we're feeling, at least from, I would say, millennials down that are online, chronically online. It's a place for people to share how they feel. It has become the diary, it has become the church, it has become the community, it has become the dinner table. And so we need to see and meet people where they're at. You might not like that they're online, but they're there. And they will like it if you show up there too.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It kind of reminds me of this like metaphor or analogy where, you have your kid and they finally come downstairs and it's just like, oh, look who's out of their room. And it's like, and if you treat the internet as sort of just like, oh, they're just doing their own thing and kind of shaming them for it, it's like no one is going to be open or listen to you if you just kind of like aren't respectful of their space and their mood and their energy. So clearly if they're excited about finding information, why not mirror that energy that they're having? So hearing all of this, that being said, might be really surprising to a lot of older generations. You might be listening to us right now and you go, what is this new generation? I don't really know what this means. This brings us to the parent gap. So Gen X grew up in a slightly different time. What is that? That was not as dramatic as I thought it was going to be. The parent gap. Gen X grew up in a slightly different time. Social media wasn't really a thing, and mental health wasn't really as normalized. And now, as those two things have become super popularized, they're trying to catch up to speed. But our report found that there still appears to be this large gap between parents and Gen Z. So Gen Z is often more well-versed in a lot of these topics, and they don't exactly trust their parents. We found that my parents ranked last on who Gen Z goes for mental health education and advice. And we found that parents also tend to go towards more traditional resources. So 62% of parents say that their mental health education is with healthcare professionals versus 47% of Gen Zs. They are also less likely to use online resources compared to Gen Z, like social media and Google, to educate themselves. And so, Dr. Courtney, I'm really curious to know, like, when you get clients coming into your office and they're sort of younger, like, do you feel like they're more well-researched? Or even if they come in with their parents, do you feel like it's actually the Gen Zer who's like, oh, I was the one who booked the appointment and found you, and I think, I need specialized treatment in X, Y, or Z? Because a lot of the times it's sort of this image of like a parent dragging their child to go to therapy, but I think that's really changed within the last decade. So what kind of are you seeing with younger clients in your office?
Yeah, well, I do have a unique job where people come into my treatment center knowing who I am, and so they've usually seen my online content, they've seen me break down the criteria of certain disorders, and they're actually seeking out coming to my treatment centers because they believe that there is ethical, high-quality expert treatment, which is why I think if you're a good clinician, get online and showcase that to everyone. But what's important is that at least the clients that are coming to see me, they say, can we break down each criteria? Can we go line by line in my diagnosis and I can describe to you how this symptom, how I experience this symptom? And also, they'll call and they'll say, do you do this treatment or that treatment? When I say that they're digitally informed, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily incorrect. They do often know what it is that they want, and that's really important. Imagine like maybe when you go to a medical doctor's office, most of us have no idea what they're doing. You know, they went to medical school, they know about the ins and outs of the body, and we're trusting them. There are medical doctors on the internet as well, and so I would be curious to know if those appointments are changing too. But mental health has become a language through which we speak. And more so in Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And so they're coming in and they're able to talk to me like they have a bachelor's in psych or a master's in psych, and they don't, but they have a bachelor's and a master's in the psychology of themselves. And I think that that's fascinating as a clinician. It is so much easier to treat someone when they really want to talk to you, and they're talking to you through the lens of stuff that you know. So it's pretty miraculous. And I would say my older clients that I do work with, the capacity goes from 18 to 65, there's a lot more fear, actually, about what it is that they're experiencing because they really don't know. And I have to teach them a lot. And the thing is the information is out there, but in the same way that the younger generations and many, many populations in this country cannot access the things that they need, older generations, they can access it, but they don't quite know how. And their brain doesn't want to sit and scroll for 3 hours. They have a longer attention span than a lot of our younger generations. And so there is a gap. And it's interesting to see how the information online, yes, it can increase anxiety because of the frequency and the amount of it, but it can also alleviate anxiety because it's like, wait, I kind of know a little bit more about myself. I'm not just completely in the dark.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even just anecdotally, as I've gone to see clinicians, I come in and I'm like, my first OCD appointment, I wasn't just like, I don't know. I was like, so here is a 10-point PowerPoint presentation as to why I have it, and the DSM and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I know that this is the gold standard evidence-based treatment. I'm like throwing out words. And then the specialist who was seeing me, she was like flipping through a book and she's like, oh, I think you know more than me. And I was like, classic OCD. But yeah, just to affirm your point, I do feel like we come in and we're just like very well researched on like exactly what we think we need. So yeah, going off of all of your observations, Gen Z is a lot more well-researched than I think parents specifically give them credit for. And I think one of the most interesting stats that we got out of our research report was that while Gen Zs take nearly 2 times longer to research mental health conditions than their parents, so roughly 16 months versus 9 months, they are also half as likely to report being misdiagnosed compared to parents who received a misdiagnosis for their Gen Z child. So while a lot of other factors might play a role in this kind of implies that Gen Z taking matters into their own hands, taking their time to research, is ultimately more beneficial in the long run. And expanding on that, when parents of Gen Zs were doing sort of their own research, they were 2 times more likely than Gen Z to say that the biggest consequence of a misdiagnosis was giving their child the wrong medication or subjecting them to the wrong type of therapy. And I think this brings up a really interesting point that, Uma, I'd love to ask you with all these statistics about misdiagnosis, and parents are trying to understand information and treatment that's out there and they're trying to catch up with their children. You know, can you talk about how older generations kind of approach mental health and mental health professionals specifically, and why is it so important to do your research when it comes to specialists, not just kind of going to any therapist that you see and going, okay, treat my child, but like why the importance of specialists?
The easiest way to illustrate the difference and the gap in our system right now is by comparing it to what we call the physical health system. And the reality is mental health is physical health. The brain is an organ. But aside from that, in conceptualizing how we go for any illness pathology, like take my example of living with cancer. Like I went to my regular PCP who found a tumor on my neck, who then had enough information to do biomarker imaging testing to then point me to a specialist for the type of cancer I might have. And then I was in cancer and am in cancer oncology endocrinology care for my thyroid cancer. That is typically what the process is. You go to someone who can triage and sort of point you to the more specialized care for any sort of physical illness. And also we have enough biological tests to be able to, it's not necessarily like the the doctor has to like think about and remember all these different possible diagnoses and systems and then sort of figure out what tests to do. There are just some baseline tests that are able to be done without the doctor having to like remember. And so from there, they can find objective data and point people to directions. And still, there's misdiagnosis. I was misdiagnosed with my own cancer journey too. However, in the mental health system, there is no such equivalent to a PCP at this point in time. People always talk about going to a therapist or going to a psychologist or going to a psychiatrist, and it's like, oh, you go there and then they'll figure out what's wrong with you and either help you themselves or point someone to someone else. That's not how people are trained in work. Even if they are generalists, they're not trained in how to identify the very nuanced complexities of different diagnoses that, again, we talked about, share these symptoms. And so we're never going to someone who can just sort of triage us and figure out where to go. And people always ask me about assessment psychologists and getting psychological testing. I can tell you from firsthand experience, when I had to get psychological testing, I had to hand my OCD diagnosis over on a silver platter and explain everything to this person because they thought it was just about hand washing and knocking. So like, they're not even, just because you're trained to do diagnosis doesn't mean you're good at it and that you know the many, many complex diagnoses in the DSM. So that's why there's such a gap in older generations intending to follow the same sort of pipeline as physical health, but that just doesn't exist right now. And so that's where social media and self-diagnosis and information gives us that, fills that gap in a really shitty way because it needs to be improved. But we get this information and then sort of figure out ourselves what specialist should we go to figure out if we have this diagnosis and what sort of treatment should we get because no one's pointing us there.
Yeah, I mean, I love hearing you talk about that because I think a lot of people don't even entirely have the language for that. And I think to your point, people are like, okay, I'm going to go see a therapist. And it's like the idea of like looking into a specialist. I think, again, echoing the OCD point, and obviously we're really passionate about it because both me and Uma are in the OCD advocacy space, but a lot of the times people just see like any general therapist, and then when they're not trained in OCD, they might, do things that help you to do more compulsions, and they ultimately make OCD worse. And you mentioned this in the report as well, where it's like the longer people spend misinformed and with the wrong types of treatment, the worse their condition gets. And I think that just really shows the importance of being well educated before you even enter these treatment spaces, I think is really like what we're emphasizing here. And so as we're talking about all of this, what also causes a large divide is being a person of color. And so this should come as no surprise to literally anyone, but despite all of the progress being made in the mental health space, people of color are experiencing a lot of barriers. So we found that 90% of Gen Z BIPOC either agree or some would agree that there's a lot of stigma surrounding mental health. And as we were surveying people, we just found that this story that kept popping up was this feeling of isolation, of feeling alone. It's feeling alone in media representation, in pop culture, in their own homes, and they are twice as likely as their white counterparts to say that the most difficult part of their mental health journey was the isolation they felt, and they were more than 2 times likely to say the biggest barrier to getting a diagnosis was, quote, not knowing anyone else who had the same symptoms. I thought it was just unique to me. And so I'm going to be speed sharing all of these stats, and then we're going to kind of zoom out larger picture as to what they even mean in relation to like this larger mental health journey. So we found that Gen Z BIPOC respondents were 2 times less likely to ask for advice on their mental health journey from their parents, 3 times more likely to choose self-diagnosis because their family wasn't supportive of them being clinically diagnosed, and they were statistically less likely to pursue treatment at all. And in fact, on every single confidence metric that we measured, Gen Z BIPOC respondents were significantly less confident on their mental health journey than non-BIPOC respondents. There's also a really large distrust in the medical field. Only 57% of Gen Z BIPOC respondents said that they felt healthcare professionals were very well informed compared to 75% of non-BIPOC, and a full 83% say they don't have much confidence in the healthcare system compared to 57% of non-BIPOC. So there's a lot of reasons why there's this mistrust. There's a lot of lack of culturally competent care. There's a history of maltreatment in the medical field. And a question I have for you, Uma, you work as a researcher, and you've also been a patient, and you've talked a lot about just so much stigma that you've encountered on both ends. Can you kind of explain to people, like where that distrust might be coming from, and what can we do to like help those people on that journey, especially if other people in the room who are people of color, like kind of what advice would you give as they're navigating all of that?
The distrust and the stigma comes from every level of our mental health care system, including and especially the fundamental core of how these illnesses are diagnosed and studied and categorized in the first place. Like the statistics that exist on how like these patient populations were studied decades ago for all different mental health conditions, there's almost no non-white people in those samples, and also females are disproportionately underrepresented as well. And so these treatments are made in mind for a very homogenous population. These diagnoses are categorized, the expressions are categorized, the interpretation of what's pathological versus what's cultural has been categorized and decided by a very homogeneous population of people, and we're just simply excluded from every level of that. To this day in 2025, every single clinical trial presentation I go to, every paper I read from genetic data about these conditions, there's always the included caveat of, oh, well, this was 95% white, just so you know, like we gotta work on that. It's always, we gotta work on that. It's not actually being worked on. And there's such a top-down and bottom-up experience of this because people like myself who might be interested in this field because of, my own lived experience, we don't even find ourselves in this field because many of us don't get the treatment and don't survive. I'm really lucky that I'm alive today to get to even worm my way into this field and improve representation both as a researcher and as someone who points out, hey, maybe in our data we should try to recruit other people who aren't just one population. So there's very good reason to mistrust, and I'm naming that because oftentimes even talking about representation or DEI, it's made so taboo, and people think it's just complaining or just wanting to feel special. Like, no, this is the reality, and we don't talk about it enough. And so as a patient and as someone who, again, navigated this system already with the lack of access to treatment, to this day, my family doesn't believe or understand that I have these conditions and still pathologizes me as someone who made them up to get attention. There are things that people take for granted as patients in terms of family support and financial support and cultural inclusion that just doesn't exist for most cultures. And so I'm over time, but translating into how that shows up clinically, I'm naming so many parts of my experience and what might be OCD, what might be PTSD, what might be, I don't know, so much of my trauma that oftentimes clinicians are not competent enough or aware enough to recognize that this is coming in part from my culture. They often pathologize things that are actually just real and a part of our system and are part of our societal and cultural standards as someone from this community, and that can cause so much harm. So advice really is to seek out and demand clinicians. You likely won't find someone who matches your identity, and that's okay because they just don't exist. I mean, we need to fix that. But it's more so finding someone who is humble enough to be curious about your experience, to do their own research outside of session. By the way, don't Google about my culture in therapy. I've had that happen before. It's funny, but it's actually horrible.
What are you?
Yeah,
I'm like I can't ask
that. Is
that.
this true? Does your culture actually say that? But yeah, don't just accept subpar care because you can't do any better. You need care that people who respect you and your experiences and are willing to learn.
Yeah, really well said. So yeah, as Uma shared, the journey for people of color is incredibly difficult, and probably because of all of this stigma and isolation, we found that Gen Z BIPOC respondents report being more reliant on pop culture to learn about mental health than non-BIPOC respondents. Notably, they were twice as likely to rely on online influencers for their mental health education, and 25% more likely to receive their mental health education from TV shows, movies, and pop culture. And so this just kind of goes to show how crucial media representation and social media is for marginalized people, but it also kind of brings up this question, okay, if these really vulnerable populations are relying so much on these resources, how can we ensure that what they're consuming is credible? So this brings us to, I already clicked it. The dropout rate. Okay, so be honest for a second. How many of you guys have tried searching for information on your mental health online and then you just kind of decided to give up at some point? You're like, I'm overwhelmed, there's too much going on. Maybe you wanted to see a therapist, but trying to find the right person that you click with or trying to find the right treatment, you're like, oh, never mind, this is too overwhelming. Or maybe you were trying to find information on a specific condition, but all of these different channels were saying completely different things and you just got confused and you just gave up. So conservatively speaking, we found that 1 in 3 Gen Zs or parents of Gen Zs who have mental health concerns about themselves or their child give up their mental health search at least temporarily. And why is that so? Well, we found that conflicting information, both online and from healthcare providers, accounts for a really large percentage of why people stop their journey, followed by questions about credibility of the information that they're receiving. And related to this, one quarter say they are simply overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information that's out there. And the fact that a lot of this information can conflict, or maybe just isn't even credible at all, makes it really, really hard for people to want to actually sit through and course through all of these different resources and websites. And so I think another really big question that people often have when it comes to self-diagnosis and social media is, how can I actually ensure what I'm looking at is credible? And so Dr. Courtney Numa, if you can kind of share, how do you vet information when you're going through online? Like, how can you tell when an influencer is, like the clinician that they say they are, their information is actually correct?
Well, the first thing I want to touch on briefly is when Uma said the brain is an organ. And I want to acknowledge that because for so long, mental health, the mind, psychology aspects of being a human in the older generations were more so perceived as just this kind of ethereal thing floating around that hopefully we can help people's minds feel better. And now with all of the information, although yes, it is a lot, being online, we are seeing it more as something scientific because of the information that's being shared. I think it's important. You also asked, like, should clinicians, therapists, professionals end up online? And yes, one, I think they should, but two, the community, the clinical community that's online right now is forcing this specialization of the mental health field even, because Gen Z and lower, we know if it's BS. Like, we can tell if you don't know what you're talking about. Like, not because your videos are poorly edited, because we follow this other person that has this specialization and this certification and this doctorate degree specifically in this field. And I'm sure Uma is going to go into the research that's necessary to see, but they know when somebody knows what they're talking about. And there's different ways to know what you're talking about. And so my part of answering this question has to do with the way that somebody, you want to know what their credentials are, of course, but you also want to make sure that they're not just making you feel good. Because just because they make you feel good doesn't mean that they're giving you the right information. And also, if they're making you feel really bad because they're scaring you and they're using scare tactics to get you to watch more than 3 seconds, you want to be mindful of that as well. So one suggestion that I have is to first pause and see, why am I following this person? Because it's okay to follow people if they make you feel good. And it's okay to follow people if their content is super dry, but it's the most scientific, research-based stuff that's making you make better and accurate decisions for your health. And so pause and ask yourself, is this a feeling follow or is this a credible follow? And both of them are okay. But of course, looking for credentials is something that's important, and looking for specializations. And eventually the algorithm will help you out as well. And so you'll end up finding more of those specialists, more of those people that get re-credentialed every single year for 10 years in that specific thing, like personality disorder treatment. Come to me. Don't come to me for OCD treatment, come to me for personality or substance use disorder treatment. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge that, yes, we want to look for people that are credible, and also the community's forcing specialization, which is helping.
And related to credentials, something in terms of vetting people is that there are a lot of people who have credentials, like they've earned a master's in exercise or a master's in art, or even, for that matter, like a master's in something related to mental health, and yet they're using that credential to legitimize themselves to talk about things that are not in their scope of practice or expertise at all. And so oftentimes you see the credential, or you see, that they have a lot of followers, that they're, and you automatically, we think, appeal to authority that they must know what they're talking about. And the other thing is, people speak with so much certainty, and when people speak with certainty, people are very interested in that content. And oftentimes, more often than not, especially when it comes to complex research and complex, nuanced topics, certainty is actually kind of a red flag, because we don't know so many things, and people not acknowledging what they don't know and talking about the nuances and, what evidence there is versus isn't, and talking through how they got to those claims. Usually you need the expertise and the understanding of research in the first place, or the understanding of the science to do that, and most people aren't doing that. And so there's in terms of vetting people and their credentials and their expertise, at the end of the day, it's looking at how are they received by their field? Are they registered with the different associations? Are they publishing papers if they're researchers? Are they affiliated with something that's credible and recognizable and respectable? Because so often people claim certainty. Some people even make up their credentials and just add lists or add certifications that aren't actually real, that don't actually matter in terms of practice or research. There's so much misinformation out there. But the last thing I want to quickly touch on is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. I encourage everyone to Google this. It's this curve of information where when someone learns a little bit about something, they feel really confident about it. And so if you sort of imagine this kind of U-shaped curve, it's like they learn a little bit and they feel like they know a lot. And then the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. And that's something that both of us have gone through or are going through with our doctorates. The training is to learn how much you don't know and learn how to interpret information and recognize what the gaps are. And most people never get to that part, and most people don't have the skill to talk about it with that nuance. So you're generally going to find people early on that are talking from a place of no expertise but speak super certainly. So be wary of that is all I'm saying.
Yeah, so obviously, as we've just heard, the journey for searching for information isn't just as easy as, okay, I'm searching for something. It can be really stressful, and it can also be really nerve-wracking, especially when it comes to more taboo conditions like a lot of people on this panel have, things like OCD. You might be afraid of what you will or will not find. So for example, with OCD, with intrusive thoughts, there's this fear that, oh, what if it aligns with my character, and what if I'm actually just this terrible person? That could prevent someone from wanting to search for information. Or in the case of BPD, there's so much stigmatizing information online. You might find really harmful depictions, or even other clinicians saying it's untreatable and those patients are really hard to work with. And so that can be really nerve-wracking to want to search through. And so we actually found that taken together, only half of those who begin their mental health journey finish successfully with treatment. And that really begs the question, okay, well, how can we prevent that from happening? How can we fully get someone from, onset to diagnosis to treatment, like that journey we were showing earlier? And so what we found is the best place to catch people is during that research phase, when they're really overwhelmed with information. When we asked what would make that research phase better, 2 solutions topped the spots for our respondents. 40% said having more well-informed healthcare professionals, and an equal 40% said if we just had one credible source that we could go to, that we knew all the information was vetted, and it would be the good starting point for our journey. And this kind of mirrors what what we've been talking about the entire time, where it's this need for having more specialized, culturally competent healthcare professionals that people can turn to, and also having, organizations like ours, Made of Millions, or just having clinicians who are willing to go online where people can trust that the starting point that they're at will lead them in the right direction. And so as we're kind of concluding, our panel, over and over again, what I think our report shows is this very nuanced, dualistic take when it comes to mental health and social media. It's not just one or the other, but it's learning how to use both intentionally. And to kind of echo what we said in the beginning, hopefully when you entered here and maybe you had some judgments, or you said, oh, none of it's valid and I don't want to be on social media, blah, blah, blah. I hope you understand that we're never going to preach that the start and ending point is social media and that it's only going to be online content. But the videos that show up on people's feeds and all of the hours that they're spending researching can end up as real world positive implications, kind of like everyone on the panel here. I mean, the internet and social media is the reason why you were able to start your treatment centers in the face of a lot of stigma. It's why, you were able to go back to school and research, and now you're able to give back. It's the reason why I was able to get an OCD diagnosis, a complex PTSD diagnosis. It's the reason why we're able to even say on this panel, today is because of the internet. And so I think what I really want to emphasize is, while Gen Z is struggling and they're really aware of themselves and they're overwhelmed and they're nihilistic, they're also really, really passionate about mental health, and they're figuring out these sort of DIY ways to get the education and the care that they need. And while social media can be kind of complicated, we do think it's ultimately helping a lot of marginalized people. And we also want to point out that they're doing this in the face of a lot of systemic issues, both globally and also more in healthcare. Globally, there is a lack of funding in social services. There's the role of big tech in people's lives, there's climate change, and also in healthcare specifically, there's insufficient insurance coverage, high treatment costs, misinformed clinicians. And I think seeing this entire picture, I always try to emphasize to people, when you see a Gen Zer who is struggling and they're feeling miserable, no one likes to feel miserable. No one is self-diagnosing, just for fun. And even if they are, to your point, if they're doing that for attention seeking, what's the reason? We really need to start questioning what these larger systemic issues are doing to kind of make Gen Z turn to these social media resources instead of just blaming them for just trying their best to cope with the resources they do have available to them. I'm trying to see where we're at on time. Just action steps really quickly. For number one, curating your feed to promote credible sources and healthy coping skills. Real quick, Dr. Courtney, what do you do to kind of like help with your feed when you're scrolling through? Like, okay, I'm gonna get good content.
A suggestion that I have for anybody that is struggling and ends up finding themselves on social media to kind of detach or numb is the algorithm is watching you. And what I mean by that is it doesn't know why you're stopping on a video. It doesn't know if it's increasing your suffering and making it worse or if you're laughing at bunnies hopping in the field. And so my recommendation is that you should have a different account that you search on for when you're struggling, where you're diving deep into finding relatable people who are experiencing the same thing as you, and then maybe another account where you look for those credible sources of information. And I say that because a lot of the clients that I treat, they come in and I'm working with them, not scrolling even when they're in treatment because we don't take phones, but they'll find themselves feeling depressed and then they'll watch a 1.5 minute depressing quote video, and then the next hour is just more stuff about them being depressed. And as much as we want to have them not do that at all, the worst part is when they're feeling okay and they open up social media and then it makes them depressed again because it's showing them the same content. And so just the algorithm is watching you, but you can control it by telling it, one, why you're watching it if you're not interested, and separating it into different accounts, because we do have to control our minds and the algorithm or it's going to do it for us. And that might sound scary, but we're in the world of AI. So.
Yeah, I was like, the bunny video was AI, and I remember that, and they fooled me. Okay, action step 2. We're running out of time, but I work in mental health advocacy, and I'd say if you listen to this panel and you're interested in starting, I would say, just start and find whatever you feel comfortable in, whatever format. You don't have to do videos, but leave comments, write articles. And I think if you're gonna be in online world, just be very mindful of not engaging in angry debates and shaming people, and it's really easy to see misinformation and want to call it out and be like, you're wrong. But I would just say, as people who do this, that's not very helpful. People don't learn from shame. But we really encourage you, if you listen to this talk and you're interested, go ahead, start that channel, start that blog. I think it's really, really needed. And then lastly, we don't have time to get into all of this, but we just really encourage you guys to really look locally for any mental health organizations. There's so many people who are probably in your city who you don't realize are doing a lot of this work online as well. And yeah, just connecting with people in person I think is really helpful. There's a lot of resources we wanted to share, but you can scan this QR code. It'll lead you to, additional resources, all of our contact information, a link to the research report that we talked about today. I think I'll probably just leave this up as we go. And I think...
I just want to say, because this was about Gen Z, please, if there's Gen Z or lower, if there's someone around you and they are talking about self-diagnosis and they are talking about their suffering, remind yourself it does not matter if it is for attention. They want you to pay attention to their suffering, and they deserve it.
Yeah, good note to end on. But thank you guys so much for coming. And that's another QR code. And then we'll stick around if you guys want to bug us or not, and we'll just like awkwardly leave,